She was laughing when the last breath left her. That's what the neighbor swore he remembered years later. The brittle, haunted memory he kept folded away like an unmailed letter. It wasn't a scream, not really. It was a sound someone makes when the world rearranges itself and they're too stunned to notice. Tamara Benson was 24, sunburned at the edges, with a laugh so bright it made other people feel warm. She should have lived longer than the stories told about her. Instead, she became the kind of memory that won't let a town sleep. A name whispered at kitchen tables, a face in the corner of photographs. A life that stopped on a quiet street in Tulsa the summer of 1990. You're going to watch this and think you know how it ends. You won't, because this is not a tidy murder mystery you solve in 2 hours. This is about the one person who can ruin you from inside. Someone who slept beside you, laughed with you, promised they would always be there. It's about how love can become ownership, how devotion can curdle into a hunger that eats everything. The person, the truth, the very idea of safety. And when the truth finally crawled up from the years, it didn't come like revelation. It came whisper soft like a friend's apology. And then the hand that dealt the final card. This is Tamara's story. This is the story of the woman who loved a man she could not have, the best friend who wanted him more than she wanted to breathe, and the small Oklahoma neighborhood that had to learn how to live after the world they knew broke. Before we dive deeper, take a second to hit that subscribe button and like the video. Your support keeps me going. Let me know in the comments below where you are watching from. Tamara Benson grew up on the east side of Tulsa, where the street lights buzzed and the porches held lawn chairs more nights than not. She moved through town like someone who believed the world would answer if you spoke to it kindly. Barista at a cafe that smelled of cinnamon and ground coffee. Music on the radio always turned up just enough. A cat named Jasper that tolerated more than he liked. She had a crooked grin that softened the sharp corners of everything around her. A way of tucking hair behind her ear that made boys trip over their words and old women nod in approval. Her best friend, Lila Hart, was the kind of person who arrived like a storm and stayed like weather. Lila had the quick smile of someone always calculating the next move. She walked like she intended to get what she wanted. They became inseparable in high school, partners in 1,000 small rebellions, skipping class for diner milkshakes, painting their initials into the backs of cheap wooden benches, daring each other to climb a fence at night just to see what the world looked like from the other side. Where Tamara softened the edges, Lila sharpened them. It seemed complementary. Light and shadow, laughter and strategy. A friendship people in the neighborhood envied because it looked unbreakable. Then Daniel Cole came to Tulsa. He had a truck with scraped paint and a voice like honey burned at the edges. Soft but with a taste of something like regret. He worked at the town's hardware supply and on weekends helped the church fix broken pews. He knew how to listen without rushing to answer. And both girls found something to hold on to in him. For Tamara, Daniel was gentle and safe. For Lila, he was a challenge, an object to be won. The three of them fell into a rhythm. Saturday barbecues, back porch conversations with cigarettes averted like apologies, the kind of evenings that smell like warm corn and sun-warmed wood. People noticed the small things first. How Lila lingered a beat too long at Tamara's door. How she learned Daniel's coffee order by heart. Then the small things gather like snow and become avalanches. Lila started showing up unannounced. She knew Daniel's shift by heart and called debate evenings, offered rides that were never refused. She learned Daniel's laugh and could imitate it so perfectly she sometimes made him laugh harder. Tamara tried to be the bigger person. She smiled and collected the stray kindnesses she was offered, promising herself she wouldn't be jealous. "We all get him," she joked once, and everyone laughed like truth was safe in the hollow of a joke. But Lila's eyes told a different story. There was a hunger in them that wasn't for food or a job. It was for possession. Lila treated Daniel like a thing to be polished and kept close, and she treated Tamara like a rival who needed to be taught boundaries. At first, the boundary setting was petty. A text here, a casual comment there that painted Tamara as needy. A rumor planted at a diner table that made other friends shift away. Tamara was too kind to notice the pattern at first. When she did, she blamed herself, choosing explanations that minimized the ugliness rather than confronting it. Summer of 1990 is the summer that everyone remembers because it was the last one when Tamara's voice filled the air. They still tell the small details. The faded yellow dress she favored that year, the music she loved, REM and old soul records, and the way she kept her keys on a bright red lanyard that clacked when she walked. There were heated arguments that summer, whispered behind closed doors. Lila and Tamara had a fight over Daniel in late June, something about a party and a kiss and part accusations that dissolved into silence. Tamara wrote in her diary, later recovered, that she felt tired of competing. She wanted to step away, to stop being one of two halves that completed a triangle. I love him enough to want him to be happy, she wrote, but I love myself enough to stay whole. On July 12, 1990, Tamara did something her friends thought oddly decisive. She told Daniel she wanted to move into a little apartment uptown and take a job at a publishing firm in the city. She had an acceptance letter. She had a plan. She told Lila with a smile and an apology, and the two hugged like everyone imagined they always would. Lila's fingers were cold. That night, a storm rolled through Tulsa. Thunder came in like someone knocking at the wrong door. Tamara's apartment on East 11th Street looked out onto a small grove of trees and a streetlight that flickered like a tired old man. Neighbors later swore they heard nothing unusual, just the storm and the rain hitting the roof. The next morning, Tamara's cat Jasper prowled the hallway, meow thin and hungry. He couldn't open the door. It took two people to force it. Inside, Tamara lay still, her yellow dress clinging to her like a drowned flag. There were signs of a struggle, marks on the floor. One lamp toppled. There was a smear of blood on the wooden sill of a window. The case shocked the neighborhood, but then settled, like dust, into the spaces people sweep and forget. Officers came. Notebooks were filled, fingerprints dusted and filed. Interviews that felt more like ritual than progress. They had suspects and theories, jealous strangers, lovers from the past, robberies gone wrong, but nothing conclusive. Lila cried and shouted and screamed in ways that matched public expectations of grief. She organized candlelight vigils and posted flyers. She cried in the arms of Daniel, who swore he had been working late that night and had no idea what had happened. People watched the grief play out like a well-rehearsed scene. Maybe that's why the investigation stuttered. Sometimes people confuse spectacle for truth. The years made the case harder. Forensic technology in 1990 had limits. There were collecting errors, a compromised sample here. Someone who threw out a crucial piece of evidence, not in malice, but in a misguided attempt to help. The detectives who'd worked the case retired or moved away. Others inherited boxes of paper and the sense that they were piecing together a jigsaw with missing corners. Tamara's mother would not accept the silence. She read the notebooks and made calls and pressed for new leads. But months and then years folded over each other like old newspapers. The case became one of those town legends people used as warnings to their children. Don't stay out late. Don't trust everyone. That's what happened to Tamara Benson. Lila never moved away. She stayed in Tulsa, like someone deliberately living inside a memory. She dated off and on, worked at a florist shop, arranged funerals with a tenderness that made people lean in close and tell her their secrets. She volunteered, consoled, made herself a pillar of the community. Daniel left town a few years later. He married someone else, moved to Kansas, and they had 2 children. He remained a face in the frame of Tamara's life, someone who might have been a villain, might have been a savior, might have been nothing more than a witness. The town learned to carry Tamara like a small, secret grief, visible only in the small acts. A candle on an anniversary, Jasper's collar and shoebox, the quiet way her mother set extra places at Thanksgiving. Cold cases have a way of waiting like seeds in the soil. Sometimes they sprout because of new tech. Sometimes someone's conscience cracks and they speak. For 35 years, the Tamara Benson file sat in a climate-controlled room, the edges of the paper soft, as if from breath. People stopped expecting answers. They made peace with the lack of closure, because what else could you do? Then, an email came to the County Cold Case Unit in early 2025. It wasn't flashy. It was the opposite. It was a kind of small, gray thing that only someone accustomed to waiting would write. A note from a lab in Oklahoma City saying they had re-examined old samples from the Tamara Benson case using new DNA techniques. They had found a partial match, something that, with additional testing, could be narrowed. It was a breath poured into a place that had been sleeping. The investigation reopened like a book with dog-eared pages. New detectives, younger and hungry for the kind of closure older officers had earned in scars, revisited interviews. They interviewed the neighbors again, who had to pull memory up from decades back, like threads. They checked Lila's background because the law insists nobody is above suspicion. Lila was cooperative as always, if anything more composed, because she had spent a life constructing herself as a pillar. She handed over old letters, old receipts, a lifetime of artifacts she thought might clear the air once and for all. Daniel answered calls from across state lines and gave a statement that was measured and weary. For the town, the reopening was a trembling at the base of the mountain. People gathered at the church and in diners, and the topic was always the same. Could it be someone they'd never suspected? Could it be someone they loved? The answer arrived in the form of a warrant and an arrest. The name on the paper was Lila Hart when she was taken into custody. The community folded in on itself like someone breathless at the sight of thunder. The arrest shocked people because, on paper, Lila had been Tamara's best friend. On paper, she'd volunteered to counsel grieving families, had worn black at the vigil, had been photographed embracing Tamara's mother. Yet on paper is just paper. In the quiet after the arrest, neighbors spoke in whispers that were more like long, slow exhalations. "I never would have guessed," they said. "She was always there." It's a common lament. The person who looks like a lighthouse turns out to have a room on the inside where the lights go out. The case file became a public spectacle. Headlines screamed betrayal. Talk shows circled the story like vultures. But the thing that made people pause wasn't the headline. It was a confession that came later. And quiet confessions are always the most terrifying because they come without fanfare, like a small animal slipping into the house after you've left the porch light on. Lila's arrest had been based on a new combination of DNA evidence and a re-examination of old forensic photographs. A fingerprint match here, a fiber comparison there. It was enough to secure an indictment. But people wanted a motive, one single neat answer to everything. And motives are not tidy. They rip like cloth, reveal layered seams. When asked, Lila said she remembered being at Tamara's apartment that night in 1990. She said she was angry. She said things she didn't mean. Her voice was not the pyrotechnic confession people expect on TV. It was a low, steady thing, the sort of voice that admitted wrongs with the simple tone of someone explaining why they'd forgotten to water a plant. "Daniel," she said once, in an interview that was recorded for the record, "I wanted him to love me. I thought if I kept him close, if I made myself the center, everything would be safe. I thought I could make him stay. The courtroom did what courts do. It turned memory into evidence, testimony into chess pieces. Tamara's mother testified and did not raise her voice. Her grief was a quiet presence that filled the room. Daniel testified too, and his face was like a map of someone lost for decades. He said he had no idea Lila harbored such dark things. Friends and former lovers were called to the stand. Old diary entries were read aloud. The jury listened. The prosecution built a timeline, airtight with the bravado of someone who had found a thread and pulled until the whole thing gave. But even as the state assembled its case, a different story whispered from the edges. The psychology of a friendship that became a war. Experts spoke about coercive control, about how possessiveness can masquerade as care. They talked about how one person's identity can dissolve into another's like sugar in coffee until the original flavor is gone. Lila's attorney argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the passage of time had made certainty impossible. The defense said she had been a devoted friend, a community volunteer, someone whose life could not be reduced to a single terrible night. What the case exposed was not only Lila's possible guilt, but the town's complicity in overlooking signs. People said in priest studies and in barbershops and in the back booths of diners that they had seen the sharpness in her, but had rationalized it. Beauty and brightness are often misread for malice or genius. They asked themselves how many times they had dismissed someone's behavior because it was easier to believe in a story you liked, that the world is mostly kind, that friends are safe. They had to look in a mirror and admit the truth. Sometimes monsters live in familiar faces. Tamara's mother, who had spent decades refusing peace out of principle, found herself holding contradictory feelings. Relief that there might be accountability. A fresh, raw grief at the betrayal of a friendship that had been all the things a mother would hope for. She stood in the courthouse and watched a woman she had known bury a secret like a second life and wonder if she was seeing the right person. She was Tamara's friend. She said in a voice that trembled. She was at her funeral. How do you live with that? When the conviction came, the community applauded like a town trying to clap away a long winter. But applause does not unmake the past. It cannot stitch together years of lost laughter or unmake the nights Tamara did not come home. Lila was sentenced to prison. The news stations replayed the mugshot and reminded people of the yellow dress. For a while, Tulsa felt cleansed, though the cleanliness was an illusion, like rubbing a stain that still smudged. And yet the story was not finished, because who kills for love, but does so in a blur of human contradictions? The confession left hairline cracks, through which more questions seeped. Lila's statement admitted to being there, to being angry, to being out of control, but also hinted at manipulation by someone else. A whisper of blackmail she refused to fully explain, a mention of a man who had promised them both something he did not deliver. People seized on the ambiguity because the human mind craves a villain simple enough to box in. As the cliff edge the town found itself on, belief and disbelief coiled together, one after another, like an electric wire. The immediate narrative, best friend kills best friend over a man, was gripping, irresistible to any true crime voyeur. But for those who had loved Tamara, who knew the shape of her laugh and where she liked to sit on the porch in the evening sun, the narrative felt small. Human lives, they realized, are messy. Motives are seldom clean. At night, people in Tulsa scroll through the story like people who read the weather and imagine their house blown away. Tamara's mother keeps a photograph that shows her daughter in the sun, a dimple on one cheek and a coffee cup in hand. In the back of her pantry, she folded Lila's old condolence note like something fragile and dangerous. She cannot unsee that Lila sat at the vigil and read a poem about loss. She cannot reconcile the poem with the quiet, terrible admission. The detectives who reopened the case carry their own ghosts. For them, the arrest solved one question and birthed a dozen others. How many times does the truth come like a crow at the window and scream until someone notices? How many cases sleep because we lack the tools to wake them? For them, Tamara's name is a ledger line in a life of small victories and daily failures. But the most unbearable part of the whole story is that it's not neat. Lila, when allowed to speak on camera 1 week before her trial, said something that did not comfort and did not excuse. "I wanted to be seen," she said, "not as someone's shadow, not as someone's friend. I wanted to be in the center." It was a plea that sounded like selfishness and desperation at once, the kind of admission that doesn't satisfy anyone except, possibly, a heart that needs to be understood. And then there was the evidence nobody had expected. A single letter discovered during the investigation, folded in an old shoebox in Lila's attic, yellowed at the edges, written in a hand that trembled but formed neat cursive. It was addressed to Tamara, and it read in part, "I promise you more than what you have. I promise to keep him for you and for me." The sentence stopped, a ragged tear of paper where someone had folded it and perhaps decided not to send it. The line sparked speculation. Who had written promises? Who had encouraged possessiveness? The letter was a mirror, reflecting more questions. And then at the last public hearing before the sentencing, a man stepped forward from the back of the courtroom, a face older, a voice that had lived through regret, and asked to speak. He did not identify himself as a new witness so much as someone who could not keep a secret any longer. He said he had been a younger man in 1990, someone who had loved the attention of two women and had not sized the consequences. He admitted to manipulating situations. He admitted to leaving the room at key moments. He admitted to letting things happen because it suited him. His name was not Daniel Cole. He was someone else, someone who had been loose with warmth and had watched the fire spread. People realized then that stories rarely have a single villain. They have a chain of small betrayals and cowardices that add up to something monstrous. Tamara's death was not only Lila's possible act. It was a thing built of omissions, of neighbors who heard arguments and chose not to knock, of a man who let two women wrestle over his attention, of a system that in 1990 could not gather DNA the way it could in 2025. The courtroom became a place where the town examined itself. The sentencing was heavy with unsaid things. Then, like any unresolved chord, the story left a final aching question. Did truth heal? The answer is no, and also yes in the narrowest sense. There was a person confined behind bars, an admission on the record, a name associated with a crime that had haunted a town for decades. But healing was not something that justice could deliver in full. It is private, slow, and often partial. The cliffhanger, for those still listening, is not a plot device. It is a simple human fact. Lila's last words before being led from the courtroom were almost inaudible. "I did it," she said, "but you don't know everything." She looked not at the reporters, but at Tamara's mother, and there was a softness that made people think of apologies. And then she paused, and the pause was full of the things you keep in the space between heartbeats. Names never spoken, a confession that would be typed and filed, an address that might lead somewhere, a hidden box. "There is another place," she whispered. "There's a letter I did not send and someone else who needs to tell the truth." The cameras caught the pause. The microphones craved the rest. But the rest did not come. Lila was led away, and the room sat like people waiting for thunder that does not roll. Outside, on a July night that smelled faintly of heat and ozone, Tulsa exhaled. The town was not the same because some justice had been served. It was the same because it had to live with what it now knew. Tamara's life could not be rewound. Her friends could not stitch time back onto the bone. But the arrest had done something else. It had pried at the scab the town had been picking at for 35 years. There are two kinds of listeners in this story. One wants resolution, names, confessions, a clean ending. The other wants the messy truth, the part about human beings doing awful things not because they're monsters inherently, but because they're hurt, because they're small and scared, because they learned that possession feels like protection. Tamara's story is both a caution and a lament. It is about a life bright enough to be loved and fragile enough to be broken. If you are watching this and waiting for the last line that ties everything in a neat bow, you won't find it here. What you will find is a woman who laughed like sunlight, a neighbor who remembers that laugh when he hears thunder, a friendship that curled inward until it became strangulation, and a town that thought it could sleep without answers, and then was forced awake. There's one last thing to know before we leave this scene. In a drawer in Lila's old house, detectives found the fold in a letter that was never sent. On the night of the search, a thin, brown envelope fell out of the bottom of a stack of unpaid bills. Inside, addressed to Tamara and never mailed, was a line that made the detective's stomachs drop. If I cannot have him, I will make sure you can't either. The rest of the sentence had been cut out, torn from the page, as if by someone who could not bear to look. The torn page is the cliffhanger. Who tore it? Why? Is the missing piece a shred of self-preservation or an act of a mind that wanted to cover its tracks? There are things detectives are still digging for. A name scratched into the back of an old photograph, a motel receipt with a smudged first digit, a confession that arrives in a bottle washed onshore decades later. The truth is messy, and it is often not a single voice but a chorus. So here is where we leave Tamara Benson, under the soft light of a memory, as the town straps itself into a new truth. Lila sits in a cell and waits, perhaps for remorse, perhaps for redemption, perhaps for the small mercy of being understood. Daniel sells building supplies in another state and makes the same mistake of thinking that moving is erasure. Tamara's mother pins the photograph back to the wall, smooths the imaginary creases, and whispers a name like a prayer. The story is over for now, but not finished. There are boxes to open, names to be cleared or condemned, and an endgame no one can predict. In a week, a month, a year, some new detail may twist everything. Or perhaps we will all sit with the discomfort of an answer that is partial and heavy. Because sometimes justice is not a storm that clears everything. Sometimes it is a slow, plain rain that reveals the bones beneath. And in the quiet, the neighbor who remembered Tamara's laugh will keep that memory like a lantern. He will remember the moment before the breath left her, and he will keep watching the street light flicker as if waiting for something else to come. They thought the story had settled into a neat grave. One name, one conviction, a town that could point to someone and say at last, there. They were wrong. The kind of lies that ripple through a community rarely die with a single verdict. They come back like ripples from a stone thrown into calm water, wider and stranger than the first splash. After Lila's sentencing, Tulsa tried to fold itself back together. People returned to their porch chairs, to the smell of coffee and the radio playing the same old songs. Tamara's mother moved into a smaller house, carried fewer memories in her hands, but more in the quiet of her chest. She slept poorly, waking to the shape of Tamara in the dark like a visitor who had forgotten to leave. The detectives stacked the case file on a shelf and called it closed, though the best of them, the ones with the hardened, hungry look in their eyes, kept looking. That is the thing about certain crimes. Even when the law draws a line, curiosity keeps tracing it, looking for the ragged edge beneath the ink. It was a paralegal at the county prosecutor's office who found the first thread that would loosen everything. She was clearing space, sorting through notebooks and exhibits before they were archived for good. In a battered evidence box labeled miscellaneous, L. Hart, beneath condolence cards and a folded program from Tamara's memorial, she found a photograph no investigator had expected to see. Tamara and Lila at the old riverfront fair, two smiles, arms slung over shoulders, but tucked behind Lila's back, half hidden in the sunlit blur of color, was a folded receipt. A motel receipt. The detective who got the call held it between thumb and forefinger, as if it were something fragile and alive. The date on the receipt was July 12, 1990. They already knew that Lila had been at Tamara's apartment that night. They also thought they knew the narrative. A fight, an unplanned escalation, a terrible moment that killed the girl everyone loved. But a motel receipt was an old key tossed into a locked room. Its numbers whispered a question. Who else? Detectives went back to their maps, to their lists, to the decades-old statements that had been collected with the patience of people who had given up on certainty. They reopened lockers and shoved aside cigarette-stained chairs. This time, the lab that had first found the DNA match combed through fibers again, with a new intensity. The partial match that had pointed them to Lila was still there, but something else glinted in the data. A faint profile, almost entirely obscured, layered beneath the more obvious print. It was the kind of thing a newer algorithm could tease into visibility, a voice from the past that now might be heard. The receipts led the detectives to a name, Mark Ellery, a city planning consultant who had been close to the Cole family and who in 1990 had a way of appearing at local events with a firm handshake and a smile that made people trust him. He was not a man anyone suspected. He was a man who built playgrounds and donated to fundraisers. He sat on boards and ate at the same diners as everyone else. They found his handwriting on a note in the same box where the photograph was tucked. The note said, "For Tam, keep this safe." Beneath it, in a different ink, the shape of a heart. When they knocked on Ellery's door, the neighborhood across from the river felt like a place outside of time. Immaculate lawns, wind chimes, the neat faces of people who trust the pattern of their days. Mark answered with a curious tilt of his head. He knew Daniels and Dieters had probably purchased their coffee the way men of his age and function do. He was polite, a little too polished, like a new set of silverware laid out for an unexpected guest. Mark agreed to speak voluntarily. He smiled as he talked about charity projects and the need to keep Tulsa's heritage alive. He sounded sincere enough to most. He also knew the women in his orbit, which is to say he had a way into certain private worlds. Tamara had once been photographed at a charity auction with him. At her arm, she had been 23, radiant, leaning forward with a glass of punch and a laugh that had been captured on film. That photograph, like most photographs, said more than the moment it froze. The detectives dug. What they discovered was a web of small liaisons and secret favors, a map of who knew whom and who wanted what. Tamara had, the paper suggested, been a woman who made a habit of giving people access to their good names. She worked evenings at the cafe that sat below Mark's building, learned how his projects hummed with life, and listened when he spoke like he was telling her something precious. She had been easy to tell things to, and she kept few secrets, at least. That is what people who loved her said. But someone else told another side. Tamara had recently found an invoice, a ledger of sorts, that suggested Mark's firm had been quietly steering contracts to certain places, skimming for profit and promising playgrounds that were never built. She had raised the oddly modern desire to speak truth publicly, in a letter perhaps, in a whisper, in a conversation with a friend who might keep it. That friend was Lila, and the timing was everything. Tamara, it seemed, had been thinking about confronting Mark, perhaps with Daniel's name in it somewhere, perhaps only with the ledger tucked inside her bag. The receipt in Lila's pocket suggested she had met with someone else that night. It suggested that someone other than Lila had reasons to prefer Tamara silent. The motel receipt was a small thing. It was not proof of conspiracy. It was a seed. Mark, when confronted with questions, turned pale. The man who made playgrounds was entangled now in the kind of accusation that eats livelihoods. He denied everything, denied knowing about ledgers, denied ever scheming. But there was a photograph where his hand brushed Tamara's hair, a photograph where Tamara's eyes shone like a small, frightened thing, and there were receipts for cash withdrawals, unusual for a man who usually wrote checks. The prosecutor had enough to bring Mark in for questioning. The courthouse, which had once been a place where people had come to watch a drama unfold, now felt like a theater of a darker play. Cameras found their way back, and the town listened the way people listen to thunder in the distance, with a mixture of fascination and dread. Then the first body was found. It was Sunday morning when the neighbor who walked his dog at dawn noticed Mark Ellery's porch light still on. The house looked small in the gray, like it might have been frozen in a single, unbearable minute. The detective who arrived felt something cold settle in his chest even before he climbed the walkway. Mark lay on the floor in the study, one leg curled beneath him like a book tucked in. An empty bottle lay on the carpet. The room smelled of sedatives and something metallic that made the detective look for more. They ruled it a suicide within hours, and the town exhaled a breath that felt like the closing of a chapter. But some of them, the ones inside the investigation who had learned to read what a scene really said, saw the small things that didn't fit. The carpet scuff and a tilt that suggested a struggle. The smear on the cuff that belonged to someone else's glove. A note in Mark's handwriting that had been folded and burned at the edges like someone had tried to destroy it and failed. The lab said the bottle contained a mixture of substances that could incapacitate and in large doses kill. The evidence was messy. The verdict felt premature. In the days that followed, strangers in diners and mothers at PTA meetings talked of how wrong the world could be. If it's true, people said, how many times did we sit next to evil? The town's idea of itself, tidy, generous, cozy, cracked. Lila watched it all from a cell where the light fell on concrete like a promise that could never be trusted. She was older now than when she had walked Tamara home that summer. She had the hollowed look of someone whose life had been pared down to essentials. She refused most interviews, signed up for only brief, lawyer-scheduled moments. But then a line of paper and ink that had been discovered by detectives cut through the noise like a blade. They found the rest of the torn letter folded inside a book of psalms that Lila had kept in her attic. It had been hidden where she believed no one would look. The sentence that had been torn from the envelope. The sentence that had been the jagged cliffhanger at the center of the town's nightmares, read in full. If I cannot have him, I will make sure you can't either. He will not keep us both. He will keep me or no one. Beneath it in a different hand, a scrawl. Bring what you have. I will be there. The scrawl matched Mark's in slant and impatience. There it was, a connection like a line pulled taut. The letter suggested not only motive, but collusion. The man who had been found dead had written to Lila, or to someone she trusted, and had promised to be with her when the act was done. The photograph tucked in a box, the motel receipt, the note burned at the edge. The evidence was not neat, but it had teeth. Lila's defense team fought like people defending something small and precious. They claimed the letter was misinterpreted, that it was a fragment of flotation taken without context. But in the court of public opinion, the damage had been done. People wanted answers, not explanations. Tamara's mother, who had once only sought accountability, now wanted something more. She wanted the town to stop being a place that hid slow, poisonous things in the corners. Then the thing nobody had seen coming happened, and it hit like a winter wind that blew the leaves off everything. One afternoon, as the courthouse emptied and the sun fell in slats across the pavement, Tamara's mother received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a key, tarnished and small, and a note with a single sentence. "The river knows." No signature. No explanation. The detectives followed the only clue they had. The rivulet and the underbrush that ran along the old industrial inlet, where the river's edge had been wild for decades. They searched with dogs and lights until their breaths fogged. Night fell low and heavy. Then the divers went in. They found relics first: a small music box, a ribbon that matched the yellow of Tamara's dress, a locket dented and half-rusted. Then, in a cold pocket of water beneath a fallen pier beam, divers felt something that made them call for a light. It was not Tamara. Her body had been found in 1990, but it was a box of negatives wrapped in oilcloth. The negatives were dated. The photos, once developed, showed faces and nights and things people had assumed were private. They developed each strip with the solemnity of those who know that images can call down verdicts. The photographs were a map of late nights, of meetings in hotel rooms, of whispers behind thin curtains. Tamara appeared in many. So did Mark. So did Daniel, his jawline relaxed in a frame where he smoked and held both Tamara's and Lila's hands. And then a face the detectives had only recently seen in court. The man who had stepped forward weeks ago with apology wrapped around his throat. A younger man made older in the photographs, but unmistakable. The negatives told a story the town had never been prepared for. Tamara had been collecting proof. She had kept a journal of names and times. And she had photographed meetings where men in suits promised pleasures and power and then took advantage of that power in private rooms in the name of friendship. Tamara had been a witness, not to one sin, but to a pattern. The group of men in those photos, powerful men the town trusted, were part of something that defied simple motives. It was not just one man who had let jealousy do the killing. It was a web of favors. Men who had used their influence to keep their places, and who had feared exposure more than disgrace. When the photos were published, the prosecutor decided there was no reason to hide them any longer. Tulsa's face changed like a mask being removed. There were names on lists now that had never been said aloud in polite company. Donors, a council member, a pastor who had counseled tears and then made arrangements in dim rooms. People who once dined shoulder to shoulder now stood in traffic, shaking their heads like people who had been looking at a painting their whole life and suddenly recognized a stain for what it was. Churches issued statements. Civic organizations canceled events. The press smelled blood and called a scandal. Then the most horrifying thing of all happened. The one that would make the town fold under the weight of its own reflection. In the middle of the night, someone drove up to the courthouse and set fire to the archival room where the original case file had been kept. Flames licked at records and photographs, blackening paper into screams. The roof sagged like an animal in pain. Detectives arrived to a scene of chaos and loss. Evidence was charred. Notebooks were gutted. The fire brigade fought with the kind of ferocity that comes from knowing the target was truth itself. At first, the town feared the burning was an attempt to erase the past. It was who would benefit, who had the resources to plan, to wait until the night and work the arson with the steady hand of someone who knows where they can do the most damage. Fingers pointed in dozens of directions. Paranoia threaded through conversations like cold wire. But the thing that sent the town spiraling toward something like hysteria was not the fire alone. It was what came next. A video posted anonymously to a social platform and shared like a contagion, with a handful of clips from the negatives and a voiceover that read from a ledger in a voice thin with rage. The voice named names. It read aloud with calm relish, ledger entries that tied payments to favors, nights to rooms, and favors to silences. The person in the video, whose face was obscured, suggested the truth was bigger than any one death. The video ended with the line, "They paid to keep her quiet. They paid to keep all of us quiet. You chose your heroes poorly." The town's polite facade fell away. People who had once felt secure in the neat arrangement of their lives now sat up at night, listening for knocks. Friends stopped answering calls. The diner where people had once traded secrets became a place where conversation was snapped short and eyes scanned the corners. Tamara's mother stopped attending church services. She sat in front of the photograph on her mantel and read the names in the negatives like an inventory, her fingers tracing the spaces between. Legal authorities moved. Subpoenas were issued. Men who had once been pillars of the community found themselves under the kind of scrutiny that makes hands shake. Some resigned from positions with a dignity that looked like avoidance. Others hired lawyers and pressed for hearings in a voice that suggested they had always been above reproach. The trial calendar stacked like a threat, and yet for every name there was a smear of doubt, a motive that might be misread, a ledger entry that might be misdated. The townspeople wanted clean justice the way children want presents. Life does not always oblige. The prosecution built case after case out of photographs and ledgers and testimony from those who suddenly remembered, from people who had been given permission by the light of publicity to say what had always made them nervous. The defense argued entrapment and misunderstanding, certain that the town would not dare to believe corruption close to home. On the night before a key set of indictments were to be unsealed, Lila asked for one last meeting with Tamara's mother. No cameras, no lawyers. They met in a small visiting room at the county jail under harsh fluorescent light that made all faces look honest and older than they were. Tamara's mother sat with a handkerchief clenched in both hands. She had learned to quiet her voice into a kind of flatness that gave her permission to speak without crumbling. Lila's face had the raw pallor of someone who sleeps badly and thinks in loops. She did not cry, not like she had in front of cameras. She looked at Tamara's mother with an exhausted intensity that begged for a kind of understanding she perhaps did not deserve. "I didn't kill her for money," Lila said first, and the words landed like stones on a quiet pond. "I killed her because I thought I was saving what I had. But I didn't know I didn't see the rest. I didn't know about the ledgers. I didn't know about the other rooms. I know how that sounds. I have heard it, and it is small. I was small then. I'm smaller now." Tamara's mother's hands tightened. "Why the river?" she asked, voice thin. Lila swallowed. "Because she kept everything there. She thought no one would look. She thought she could bury proof like it was a secret and keep us all safe. She intended to expose them. That's what terrified them. Some of them offered me things. Others offered me nothing and wanted me to keep quiet. I was ashamed of my jealousy. I thought being the only one would mean I had something. I was a coward looking for love." There was a pause pregnant with accusation, with admitted sin. "Do you regret it?" Tamara's mother asked. Lila's eyes filled, not with tears, but with something that looked like regret shaped into bone. "Every second," she said. "I am sorry to her every minute. But I am also sorry that I was the key they needed. I thought if I removed her, I could stop some of it, because I was angry at being pushed aside. I didn't realize I was cutting through a net. I didn't know that other people would feel they had to protect the net, by removing the person who tugged at it. Tamara's mother looked simply at Lila. "Who else?" she asked. Lila's mouth opened and closed like someone breathing underwater. Then she leaned close and said one name, a name that the town knew, that many had loved, that many had defended. When she said it, the word itself seemed to reconfigure the room. Tamara's mother felt the floor under her shift. The name rolled down the corridor and into the world and broke things open. The next morning, the named man was arrested. The town reeled. Newspapers printed the name in large type, and the man's smile and photographs seemed an insult. He had argued in public for family values, for the importance of keeping neighborhoods safe. His indictment cracked more than reputation. It cracked faith. But the shock was not over. It was only beginning. In the weeks that followed, a pattern emerged like a map being traced by shaking hands. A network of men who had for years done favors for favors, who had used influence to keep themselves in positions of unearned trust. They had used their presence, their money, their pledges, their gifts, as a kind of curtain behind which awful things could happen. The photos and the ledgers became the thread that pulled through a tapestry and let everyone see the seams. Lawsuits were filed. Resignations occurred. There were memorials and candlelight vigils for truths the town hadn't wanted to face. And yet the final blow, the true cold terror that made the town feel like a body that had been betrayed by its own heart, came not from a courtroom, but from inside the prison where Lila sat. One morning, the guards found Lila in her cell on the floor, an empty envelope crumpled beside her. She was alive, barely. The medical team worked with the terrible practice speed of people who know how close to the edge of life can be. In her hand, clenched like a talisman, was a small rectangle of plastic. It was a card with a number printed on it and an address scrawled on the back. She was taken to the infirmary. The doctor's brow tightened as they watched her breathe. The card was tested for DNA. The envelope bore a smear of lipstick that did not match Lila's. But the thing that made the hair stand on the backs of the detectives' necks was not the physical evidence. It was what Lila mumbled as she slept half out, half alive. "They promised me safety. They promised me a place to live if I did it in a cabin by the river." Ledgers, motel receipts, photographs, all led back to the cabin. No one had thought to look there because cabins were part of the town's myth. Places for weddings, for scouts, for summer camp songs. But when detectives went to the cabin at the river's bend that night, the things they found were the kind of proof that makes even the season feel cold. There were markings on the floorboards, aged and stained in a pattern that matched the oilcloth negatives. Beneath a loose board, wrapped in plastic and cloth, was a small stack of tapes, audio tapes, yellowed with age. They played them. The room was silent, and the tape hissed like a thing sighing. At first, the recordings were mundane, conversation between men who laughed too loudly at the wrong times. Then a woman's voice, muffled and bright, said things like, "You'll have to tell him it was an accident, and promise you'll be there." The tapes contained voices and laughter, and the kind of casual cruelty that is the most dangerous. The kind that sounds like a joke until it finishes a plan. There was an implication of a night in which multiple men had met with both women, had joked about what they might lose or gain. There was the sound of feet shuffling, a muffled argument, then silence and the distant rush of water. The tapes were not a clean picture, but they were enough. Enough to show that Tamara's death had not been only the product of a jealous best friend. It had been fed by a network of men who, fearing exposure, had given Lila the tools she would need and the promises she would cling to. Promises of money, promises of safety, promises of silence. They had assured her that the worst that would happen was the quiet of a town that would forget. Instead, the worst that happened was the unraveling that followed. When the tapes were released, the town convulsed. Men who had been pillars were dragged into questions. The church, where so many had sought comfort, asked for audits. Funds were frozen. The city council canceled a meeting and then another. People in the neighborhood where Lila had once lived now looked at her house like one might look at a broken clock, something that had once measured time but now only recorded stoppage. In the courtroom, the case shifted from a single night of violence to a broader indictment of community rot. Prosecutors added counts. Defense attorneys cried foul. The media feasted. The town, which had loved the naked certainty of judgment, found itself learning new words: conspiracy, complicity, culture, silence. Words that did not settle into neat definitions. At last, the final act came in a way that was small and yet absolute. On a rainy afternoon that made the courthouse steps shine like polished stone, Lila chose to speak again. This time, she gave a recorded statement that was not delivered as a defensive tactic, but as a confession turned inside out. She told in flat sentences that held all the weight of a confession how she had been flattered, groomed, and given the illusion of power. How Mark had promised her a place at his side if she did what they asked. How other men had given her money, rides, words that sounded like love until the night it did not. She did not exculpate herself. She did not ask for forgiveness with flowery speeches. Then she named one last thing. Not a person, not a ledger, but a philosophy. They taught me that keeping a secret made me special, she said. They taught me that if I stood by them, I would be protected. That lesson is a weapon. The judgment that followed did not land like lightning. It arrived in slow, sober sentences. The men were tried, some convicted, some acquitted. Some had charges dropped for lack of concrete evidence. Some fled into plea deals. The town's civic life was altered. The schools brought in counselors. The coffee shop spoke of before and after. There were books written about the case, think pieces, late-night specials that framed it for audiences who liked to name themselves as moral arbiters. But even the verdicts could not stitch what had been torn. The real shock, the final gust that left Tulsa gasping, was not legal. It was the way people discovered themselves in the mirror. Neighbors who once waved now averted their eyes. People whispered about friends they had assumed they knew. Those who had been accused swore and sued. Those who had remained quiet paid the price in a quiet, corrosive suspicion. Tamara's mother moved away at last, not entirely because she wanted to, but because staying felt like living inside the eye of a storm that kept turning back to her face. The photograph on her mantel came with her, wrapped carefully in cloth. She pinned it to the wall of her new apartment and taught herself to sit with the memory and not the accusation. Some nights, she would watch the news and see faces she had once recognized in church pews, and she would whisper Tamara's name as if it were a benediction. There are stories that end with a kind of cleanliness, and there are stories that end with the knowledge that the world is complicated and that justice is slow and often partial. Tamara's story ended both in a conviction and in an ache. It ended with Lila behind bars, with some men disgraced, others walking away, and with a community forced to look at itself and not like a mirror, but like a raw, exposed place. The worst shock of all, perhaps, was not the exposure of corruption or the revelation of collusion. It was the realization that people could be both cruel and vulnerable, that monsters were the faces of neighbors, that the person you trust to stand at your side in life might be the person who helps undo you. It was the knowledge that love can be twisted into ownership, that kindness can hide predation, and that grief threads through communities in invisible ways. On the last page of the story, long after the trials and the tapes and the resignations, a neighbor remembered Tamara's laugh. He would tell the story slower now, and with more curiosity than accusation. He would say that the truth had been messy and that it had required more than a verdict to settle. He would say that the town had been shocked not only because of the crime, but because it had recognized the possibility that it had been part of the crime by silence. And in the quiet that remained, the final image was not of a courtroom or a cell, but of a small river at dawn, where the water moved with a patient indifference of time. There, someone had tied a yellow ribbon around a sapling near the bank, a thin, bright thing fluttering against the gray sky. It was not a monument. It was a small human thing, a place for memory, a place for sorrow, a place that would not be allowed to forget. Tulsa would be different after Tamara. It would build new playgrounds, hold new meetings, hire new people, and still it would carry what it had learned like scar. The story closed not with the neat clap of a final verdict, but with the long, weary sigh of a town that had been forced to see itself as it actually was, beautiful in places and broken in others, and always capable of both harm and repair. To date, it hurts to tell the story of Tamara, because she's gone forever. But the beauty part is that the case is solved, and justice has been served. Don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and turn on the notification bell, so you stay updated with mystery cold cases. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Thanks for watching.